Rylan first heard about the noise in the most mundane of ways, a complaint filed with his small audio restoration company. A voicemail left by a local musician crackled through his phone speaker, her voice breathless and uneven. It's like nothing I've ever heard. Or, God, how do I explain it? It's not feedback. It's not static. I don't know. Please, just come check it out. He stared at the phone for a moment after the message ended. The caller, Hannah, was a pianist he'd worked with several times before. She wasn't prone to dramatics. If anything, she was meticulous to the point of being irritating. But this sounded desperate. The afternoon light slanted through the window of his cramped studio, catching dust motes that hovered lazily in the still air. Rylan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. Sleep had been elusive lately. He blamed it on the grind of work, the endless parade of hiss-filled cassette tapes and warped vinyl he'd been hired to clean up. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just exhaustion. It was the quiet, the moments between tasks where he found himself staring at nothing, feeling nothing. Hannah's home was immaculate, as always. The piano gleamed under the overhead lights, its keys polished to a mirror sheen. But the musician herself was a wreck. Her eyes were ringed with shadow, and her fingers trembled as she gestured toward the equipment she used to record. It's been happening for days now, she explained, her voice low. At first, I thought it was my headphones or interference, but it's not. It's there even when everything's off. Rylan frowned and set up his portable diagnostic gear. He prided himself on being able to identify anomalies others missed. Electrical hum, ground loop issues, amateur stuff. He was the guy people called when the professionals failed. The equipment hummed to life, but what it showed didn't make sense. No interference, no spikes, no frequencies out of range. It was as clean a signal as he'd ever seen. I don't hear anything, Hannah, he said finally, pulling the headphones off. Her gaze snapped to his, wide and pleading. You're not listening. It's not what's there. It's what's missing. The drive home left Rylan uneasy. Hannah's words stayed with him, looping in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. It's what's missing. He turned the radio on, then off again, irritated by the static that didn't quite cover the silence in his car. That night, lying in bed, he thought he understood what she meant. It started as a pressure at the edge of his awareness, like the weight of too many blankets on a summer night. He sat up, ears straining, but there was no hum of the refrigerator, no faint creak of the building settling. Even his breathing felt muffled, like the world had slipped a soundproof curtain between him and reality. And then there was the absence. It wasn't a lack of sound, not quite. It was something deeper, an emptiness that stretched and pulled at him in ways he couldn't describe. He pressed his palms against his ears, heart racing, but the sensation wasn't external. It was inside him, burrowing into the hollow spaces he didn't know existed. Memories flickered like static. His mother's voice on the last phone call they'd had before her death. The laugh of the girl he let slip away years ago. A child's cry. His brother's, from decades ago when he wasn't fast enough to catch him. He shook his head violently, forcing the thoughts away, and stumbled to the kitchen. The sound of water running from the faucet was a relief, anchoring him in the present. But even as he gulped it down, the silence waited, coiling at the edges of the noise like a predator waiting to strike. Over the next few days, the noise, or the non-noise as he began to think of it, lingered. It crept into the studio during work hours, turning the hum of electronics into something oppressive. Clients started canceling appointments, citing vague discomforts and inexplicable unease. One woman burst into tears midway through her session, clutching her ears and babbling about shadows in the silence. Rylan told himself it was coincidence, but the rationalizations rang hollow. One evening, while working late, he swore he heard something within the absence. Not a sound, but a shape. A flicker in his peripheral vision, like the suggestion of a face where there shouldn't be one. His hands trembled as he adjusted the dials, though he wasn't sure what he was trying to fix. The sound couldn't be recorded. It couldn't be quantified. But it was changing him. When Hannah called again, her voice was nearly unrecognizable. "I can't take it anymore," she whispered. "It's inside me, Rylan. It's taking me." He drove to her house without thinking, speeding through the dark streets. But when he arrived, the house was silent. Too silent. Hannah was sitting at the piano, her hands resting limply on the keys. Her mouth was open, as though frozen mid-scream, but no sound came. Her eyes stared past him, through him, into something he couldn't see. The silence in the room was suffocating. A vacuum that devoured every breath, every heartbeat. He turned to leave, but stopped cold at the doorway. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadow that didn't belong. It wasn't cast by any light. It was a void, an absence, impossibly black and impossibly real. Rylan ran. Rylan didn't remember the drive home. The streets blurred into a shapeless haze, his trembling hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled desperation. His chest ached from shallow, rapid breaths, his mind clawing for rationality that wouldn't come. Hannah's frozen expression haunted him, her gaping mouth, her vacant eyes. That shadow, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. When he finally stumbled through his apartment door, the oppressive weight of silence greeted him. Not the comforting quiet of an empty home, but a smothering void that seemed alive, pulsing in sync with the erratic thrum of his heart. He reached for the television remote, fumbling to flood the space with noise. But when the screen flickered to life, even the background static sounded wrong. Hollow. As though something had gutted the sound and left only its empty shell. Sleep was out of the question. He sat hunched at his kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee clutched in his hands, the hours stretching into a nightmarish eternity. Every creak of the building, every distant car passing outside, felt magnified and distorted, as though the silence around him was twisting reality itself. The memories returned, unbidden and relentless. His mother's soft hum as she folded laundry, the kind of sound you never notice until it's gone. The way his ex-girlfriend used to tap her fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of songs they never finished. The last voicemail from his younger brother before the accident, a snippet of a joke he could barely recall, but now wished he'd saved. Each memory unraveled him further. The silence wasn't just taking sounds, it was erasing the spaces they once occupied, leaving jagged holes where comfort and connection used to be. Work became unbearable. Clients stopped showing up entirely, leaving Rylan alone in the studio. The equipment, once a reassuring extension of himself, now seemed alien, hostile. He couldn't bring himself to turn it on. What if the silence came through? What if it spilled into the room, into him? The city outside felt distant, muted. People moved as if through a fog, their faces drawn and hollow. He passed a man on the street muttering to himself, the words slurred and disjointed. "It's all empty. Shapes in the noise. They're coming for us." Rylan quickened his pace, but the man's voice followed him, echoing in his mind long after it faded into the stillness. By the third day, the silence began to manifest physically. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a faint pressure against his skin when the room was quiet. But then, it grew bolder. In the middle of the night, he woke to the sensation of something brushing his face. His bedroom was pitch black, but the darkness felt deeper, thicker than it should have been. He reached for the lamp, his fingers trembling. But when the light clicked on, there was nothing there. Nothing except the silence, which seemed to mock him, pressing against his ears like invisible hands. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You can't be real." The silence didn't respond, but he felt it listening. Desperate for answers, Rylan threw himself into researching anything that might explain what was happening. He scoured forums, read obscure articles about auditory hallucinations and psychological phenomena, but nothing came close to describing the absence he experienced. One thread, buried deep in a discussion about unexplained auditory anomalies, caught his attention. The void isn't a sound. It's the lack of what we need most. It's the echo of what we fear losing. Don't listen too closely, or it'll fill the spaces inside you until there's nothing left. He stared at the words, his stomach twisting into knots. The post had no replies, the author's account deleted. Rylan closed the laptop and stared into the quiet of his apartment. The hum of the refrigerator was gone. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall had ceased. The only sound left was his own ragged breathing, and then, faint but unmistakable, he heard it, a whisper of nothingness, curling around the edges of his mind like smoke. He covered his ears, but it was no use. The absence was inside him now. The hallucinations worsened. The shadow that had loomed in Hannah's home began to appear in his own apartment, first in fleeting glimpses, then lingering in corners, watching. It had no form, no features, but Rylan felt its presence as surely as he felt his own heartbeat. It didn't need to speak. Its silence was louder than words, a crushing weight that drove him to his knees. He began to see things within the shadow, warped reflections of his own memories, distorted and wrong. His mother's face twisted in anguish, his ex-girlfriend staring at him with empty sockets where her eyes should have been. His brother's voice, faint and garbled, crying out from within the void. Rylan screamed, but no sound came out. By the end of the week, he was barely functional. The apartment was a wreck, dishes piled in the sink, papers scattered across every surface. The silence devoured all motivation, all energy, leaving him a hollow shell. But worst of all was the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The shadow followed him everywhere now, a constant reminder of what was coming. He tried to fight it, blasting music until his speakers blew, leaving jagged bursts of static that only made the silence worse. He tried to drown it in alcohol, but the quiet only grew heavier, suffocating him. As he sat in the ruins of his living room, the shadow crept closer, its edges spilling across the walls like ink. For the first time, it felt tangible, solid. "You're not real," Rylan whispered again, his voice trembling. But he didn't believe it anymore. Rylan didn't leave his apartment after the 7th day. The outside world was meaningless now, just another quiet place, another stage for the silence to seep into. The void followed him, thickening every shadow, swallowing every sound. Sleep was a distant memory, Eating felt pointless. He existed, but only just. The shadow loomed in every corner now, a growing presence that seemed to pulse with his own fear. He couldn't escape it. When he turned on a light, it shifted to the edges. When he closed his eyes, it was waiting behind his lids, a darkness so complete it felt like falling. He no longer screamed. What was the point? No sound came, and even the effort felt stolen by the silence. It was on the 8th day that the silence spoke. He had been staring at the ceiling for hours, his mind a fractured loop of regrets, fears, and fragmented memories. The hum of white noise he'd left running on his laptop finally cut out, leaving a hollow, suffocating quiet in its place. Then it came, not a voice, not a sound, but a vibration deep in his chest, reverberating through the hollow places inside him. Do you hear me now? Rylan sat bolt upright, his heart hammering. The words weren't spoken, they weren't even thoughts. They were felt, like the echo of a long-forgotten emotion that didn't belong to him. I am what you've lost, what you've feared, what you'll never find again. He clutched his head, his breathing ragged. You're not real, he rasped, the words barely audible in the oppressive quiet. The shadow in the corner shifted, sliding closer. For the first time, it took form, not human, not animal, but something shapeless and endless, a void that bent the air around it. I am as real as you. Desperation surged through him, a wild, animal instinct to run, to fight, to do something. He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky, and grabbed the only thing he could find, a shattered glass from the floor. The edge bit into his palm as he clutched it, the sharp sting grounding him for one fleeting second. What do you want from me? He screamed, though his voice was swallowed before it left his lips. The shadow loomed larger, enveloping the room. You already know. Images flashed before him. His mother's face, tired and kind, asking him to call more often. His brother's mangled bike on the side of the road, the guilt that had never left. The empty side of the bed where his ex had once slept. Her absence, a wound he had never allowed to heal. You gave me life, the silence murmured, its presence pressing against him, suffocating him. I am your fear, your failure, your loss, and I am hungry. Rylan staggered back, his body trembling. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a noise, wasn't just a shadow. It was him, his own emptiness, his own failures, given shape and voice. He ran. The glass fell from his hand, shattering again as he bolted from the apartment. The hallway outside was silent. The world beyond, devoid of the faint hum of life he had always taken for granted. He stumbled into the street, barefoot and disheveled, the cold pavement biting at his feet. But the shadow followed, slithering along the walls, seeping into the cracks of reality itself. The city was abandoned, or maybe it wasn't. He couldn't tell anymore. The silence had stripped the world of its substance, leaving only echoes of what once was. The house appeared as if summoned, a squat, gray structure at the end of a street he didn't recognize, its windows dark and yawning. It wasn't just empty, it was waiting. Rylan hesitated at the threshold, but the shadow pushed him forward, a cold wind at his back. He stepped inside, the door creaking behind him before slamming shut with a finality that made his breath hitch. Inside was worse than he imagined. The silence here was heavier, thicker, pressing against him like water in his lungs. The air shimmered, distorted, as if the house itself was unraveling. The walls were lined with objects: his old baseball glove, a school photo of his brother, a crumpled receipt from the night of his first date with his ex. Every artifact was warped, wrong, the colors leached, and the edges fraying. In the center of the room stood a mirror. Rylan approached it slowly, his feet dragging against the floor. The reflection was familiar but off, his face pale, his eyes hollow, his movements lagging behind his own. And then the reflection smiled. "You can't run from nothing, Rylan," it said, its voice his own. "You are nothing." He fell to his knees, his hands gripping the floor as the silence surged around him, pulling him into its depths. His memories blurred, his sense of self dissolving. He screamed again, but the sound was lost, devoured before it even left his throat. The shadow enveloped him completely, and for one brief, terrible moment, Rylan felt at peace. The silence wasn't an absence. It was everything he had tried to ignore. As the void consumed him, his last thought was of how quiet the world would finally be. When the house was found days later, it was empty. No furniture, no belongings, no sign anyone had ever lived there. Just one room with walls so quiet that not even the sound of a whisper could disturb it. And in the corner, a shadow waited.